Does a police officer have the right to mock the memory of the dead just because he believes no one is left to stand up and answer back? Your dad was a hero. The officer laughed, short, clipped like a verdict already reached. I hear that one all the time. Luke Cole. 8 years old, didn't answer. He closed his small hand tightly, holding his father's military dog tag against his chest. The worn metal pressed into his skin. A real hero wouldn't leave his kid with nothing but a piece of metal, the officer continued. Real heroes have records. Another laugh followed, then a few nods of agreement. Skepticism spread faster than compassion. Luke stood still. He didn't cry. He didn't react. His eyes didn't meet the officer's. They rested instead on the faded letters etched into the dog tag. Do you even know your father's rank? Yes, Luke said. What was it, Sergeant Major? The officer narrowed his eyes. That rank isn't something you just make up. The waiting room sagged for a brief moment, not out of respect, but in anticipation, waiting to see how this child would break. But Luke didn't break. He only tightened his grip on the memory of a man who was gone right in front of the adults who were laughing at it. And in that moment, a moral line was crossed. If you believe that true courage doesn't live in gunfire, but in the silence of those who have walked through war, subscribe to Service Honor Stories so we can preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence owed to our quiet heroes. Luke said nothing more. The boy simply closed his hands slowly, deliberately, letting his father's military dog tag rest firmly in his palm. The old metal was cold and heavy, pressing into his skin, like a familiar reminder. This wasn't an impulsive gesture from a wounded child. It was a motion he had repeated many times whenever Luke needed to hold on to what mattered most. Emily Cole stood beside her son. She saw it all clearly, the eyes fixed on Luke, the half-smiles that hadn't fully faded, and the careless silence of the adults around them. She knew it for what it was, humiliation. But Emily didn't step forward. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She placed her hand on her son's shoulder, firm, yet gentle, like an invisible wall standing between Luke and a world that was scrutinizing him. Are you okay? Emily asked softly. Luke nodded. Yes. Just one word. Short. Enough for her to understand. Luke's silence began to separate itself from the room. It didn't demand attention. Yet it stood out against the scattered noises of grown-ups' chairs, scraping papers, rustling whispers behind backs. Not one of them stepped in. No one said it had gone too far. No one bent down to a child's level to ask how he was feeling. Luke stood straight. His shoulders didn't sag. His back didn't curve. He didn't press into his mother for protection, nor did he turn away to hide. His hands rested in front of him, the dog tag between them, his thumb gently tracing the faded letters. Luke didn't read them out loud. He didn't need to. Those letters were etched into him through memory, through the short stories his mother told at night, through the long absence of an empty chair at home. A man in the waiting room glanced over, then looked away. A young woman pressed her lips together, her eyes uncertain, but said nothing. The officer who had mocked him returned to his work as if everything were finished. To him, Luke's silence meant there was no longer a problem to solve. But that silence didn't disappear. It began to carry weight. Emily noticed it in the way her son stood. Luke wasn't trembling. He wasn't restless. He stood as if holding a position that had been assigned to him, as if an invisible discipline required him to stand it through. Emily knew that feeling well. She had seen it before in her husband, the way a man grows quiet when he no longer needs to prove anything. Let's sit and wait, Emily said. Luke looked at her, then nodded. They sat down on the bench against the wall. Luke placed his feet parallel his back, straight, the dog tag still in his hand. Emily didn't ask anything more. She knew there were moments when words from adults only burden a child with the need to explain. She chose to stay beside him, close enough to protect him, quiet enough not to overshadow the steadiness taking shape within Luke. The room carried on as usual. People returned to what they were doing, but the air had changed. Luke's silence was no longer an empty space others could fill with laughter. It had become a counterweight, a presence that made the surrounding noise feel unnecessary. It wasn't submission, and it wasn't weakness. It was the dignity of a child not yet old enough to defend himself with words, yet mature enough not to let go of the truth he believed in. And in that moment, at least one person in the room saw it, though no one dared to say it out loud. That silence didn't fade away. It began to spread, reaching the ears of someone who didn't know how to look away and preparing to become something no one in that room would be able to ignore. Officer Daniels didn't stop. Luke's silence didn't slow him down. It only seemed to give him more space to fill with the sarcastic tone he'd long used on people who couldn't answer back. Sergeant Major Daniels repeated, stressing each word as if testing how much pressure the story could take. "That's not a rank you just say." A soft laugh broke out behind them. Then another. Not loud, but enough to form an invisible circle closing in around the mother and her son. Daniels leaned forward. "Do you have any idea how long it takes to become a real sergeant major? How many years without mistakes? How many records signed?" Luke lifted his head. His eyes were steady and clear. "My father served 22 years, Luke said. His voice was even, not raised, not shaking. Daniels paused for half a beat, then laughed louder. 22 years. He turned to the man beside him. "Sounds like a nice round number." Someone else chimed in. "Probably memorized it." The laughter spread. It wasn't an explosion of cruelty. It was the easy laughter of people who feel safe inside a crowd. The humiliation was no longer one man's words. It had become a silent agreement shared by many. Daniels pressed on. "What unit?" Luke answered immediately. "Advanced training. We're Fort Benning." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Oh, that's very specific. Specific enough to sound suspicious." Luke didn't step back. "My father didn't like to brag," he said. "He said if you need others to believe you, then you've already done something wrong." The room dipped into silence for a brief moment. But then the laughter returned as if someone had tossed a small stone into water, and the ripples quickly erased that rare stillness. Emily stepped forward. She looked Officer Daniels straight in the eye. "That's enough," she said. Her voice was low but firm. Daniels folded his arms. "I'm just asking questions," he replied. "It's a kid's story." Emily placed her hand on her son's back. "We're leaving," she said. Luke turned to his mother. "I'm not finished." Emily bent down, her eyes level with his. "You don't need to say anything more," she whispered. "You've said enough." Daniel shrugged as if things had ended exactly the way he wanted. "See," he said to the others. "No big deal." Emily guided Luke away from the counter. Not rushed, not flustered. Every step upright as if she refused to let the humiliation touch the way they stood. Luke followed his mother. He didn't lower his head. He didn't look back. The dog tag remained firmly in his hand. But just before they moved fully away, Luke stopped. Just for a moment. He turned back and looked at Officer Daniels, not in challenge, not in anger. "My father used to say Luke spoke when people laugh at the truth. It isn't the truth that becomes weaker." Daniels didn't respond. He turned back to his paperwork as if he hadn't heard a word. Emily rested her hand on Luke's shoulder, gentle but certain. "Let's go," she said. They walked toward the waiting benches. Behind them, the room quickly returned to its usual rhythm. The people who had laughed turned to other conversations. To them, the moment had passed. A small story. A quiet child. No consequences. But not everyone looked away. At the far end of the hallway, an older man had stopped his work some time ago. He hadn't joined the laughter. He hadn't avoided the boy's eyes. He stood still, listening to every question, every answer, every pause filled with doubt. He remembered that name. He remembered that voice. And he knew there were some things that could not be brushed aside as a child's story. While the crowd believed it was over, one man had heard everything, and for him, this was only the beginning. The mop stopped halfway across the floor. Mr. Reynolds stood still, his calloused hand frozen in place as if it had just touched something hard and cold from the past. He no longer looked down at the floor. His eyes were fixed on the boy sitting beside his mother on the waiting bench, where silence still rested intact in the small hand clenched around a military dog tag. The name that had just been spoken didn't pass through his ears like a sound. It struck straight into memory. James Cole. A name once called during roll calls that never needed a checklist. A commander who never had to raise his voice to give orders. A teacher who didn't lecture at length, he simply stood where the task was hardest first. And to Reynolds, he was the man who had pulled him back from the thin line between life and death. He remembered it clearly. Not the whole scene. Only the sharp details. A hand gripping a strap as he slipped. A low, clipped voice, "Control your breathing." Then the quiet afterward when everything had settled, and James Cole only nodded and walked away, as if saving a man's life wasn't worth mentioning. Reynolds looked back at the room. The people who had laughed had already turned away. The officer was back to his paperwork. No one noticed that a line had just been crossed. No one except him. He walked slowly into the hallway. Not rushed, not hesitant. Each step steady like an old habit from a life shaped by discipline. He pulled an old phone from his pocket. The screen was chipped at one corner. The contact list was short. One name appeared as soon as he typed the first few letters. Reynolds lifted the phone to his ear. "It's me," he said. His voice was low, clear. "There's something you need to know." He didn't explain at length. He didn't recount everything. He didn't need to. The man on the other end understood very well that if Reynolds was calling, it wasn't a small matter. "Yes," Reynolds continued. "Right now." The call ended. Reynolds stood still for one more beat. He didn't look back into the room. He didn't need to. What had to be done was done. The rest no longer belonged to him. He returned to his work. The mop moved again, but the rhythm had changed. No one noticed him. No one knew that in that brief moment, something unseen had been set in motion. Inside the waiting room, Emily sat beside her son. Luke still held the dog tag in his hand. There were no more questions, no more laughter. The earlier noise had settled into something unfamiliar, waiting without anyone naming it. The officer glanced at the mother and child once, then turned away. To him, it was over. The child was quiet. The mother had pulled him from the counter. No complaint, no disturbance, no consequences. But Reynolds knew better. Some consequences don't arrive immediately. They don't need threats. They don't need alarms. They only need the right person to hear the right thing at the right time. He glanced at his watch, not to count minutes, but out of habit, like someone waiting for orders. There was no anger in him. Only a familiar feeling responsibility, not the responsibility of a janitor. The responsibility of someone who had been taught that honor does not defend itself, people must stand up for it. Reynolds passed by the bench. His eyes brushed past Luke for the briefest moment. He didn't stare. He didn't nod. Just enough for the boy to know that someone had seen him, and enough for Reynolds to know that he hadn't arrived too late. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer a forgotten silence. It had changed its nature. It had become the pause before something happens. Because justice doesn't need noise once it has started moving. No one can call it back, and the next door is about to open. The door opened. No signal was given. No announcement made. And yet the room fell quiet on its own, as if it had sensed that a different order had just stepped inside. The man paused for a brief moment at the threshold. Colonel Adams. His posture was straight, his stride steady, his eyes not searching. He didn't look toward the front desk. He didn't seek the gaze of any officer. He walked past them as if the laughter from moments before had never existed. Emily looked up first. Luke felt his mother's hand tighten slightly. Colonel Adams walked directly to the bench against the wall. He stopped in front of the boy close enough to require him to look up, but not close enough to impose. He came to attention, and he saluted Luke first. The entire room froze in silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence that follows when a higher principle has just been placed on the ground. "Hello, son," Colonel Adams said. His voice was low, clear, unraised. Luke stood by instinct. No one had taught him to do it. But his body understood. He placed his feet parallel, his back straight, his hands clasped tightly around the dog tag at his chest. "My name is Luke Cole, sir," he said. His voice was small, but steady. Colonel Adams lowered his hand and looked directly into the boy's eyes. "I know," he replied. A name spoken with respect. Emily stood as well. Before she could say a word, Colonel Adams turned toward her and gave a slight nod. Not a courtesy, a recognition. "Thank you for raising him this way," he said. "Very few people do." The officer at the front desk went rigid. None of the colleagues around him spoke. No one asked who the man was. There was no need. The way he stood, the way he chose where to look and where not to, answered everything. Colonel Adams turned back to Luke. "You're holding your father's dog tag," he said. "Yes, sir," Luke replied. "You know who he was?" "Yes, sir." "You know what he did?" Luke nodded. He taught others how to stand. A very brief silence passed. Colonel Adams pressed his lips together not to restrain emotion, but out of respect for the answer. "Your father is the man who taught me that," he said. "And today I see it continuing." He turned his gaze, sweeping the room. He didn't linger on anyone for more than a moment. But every person felt seen. There are places, he said, where truth doesn't need to be interrogated. And there are people, he continued, who don't need to prove themselves. No one spoke. No one laughed. Power had shifted. Not through orders, not through raised voices, but through a man with authority choosing where to stand and whom to salute first. Colonel Adams turned back to Luke and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, gentle but firm. "You may sit," he said. "You've stood long enough." Luke sat down. Emily sat beside him. Her hand remained on her son's back, but the pressure had changed. Lighter. More trusting. The officer at the desk lowered his head slightly. No one had told him to, but his body understood as well. Colonel Adams remained standing for one more beat. Then he spoke his voice low enough for only those in the room to hear clearly. "We will continue this conversation." And in that moment, the room had changed hands not by authority, but by honor finally spoken by its proper name. Colonel Adams stood still before the row of benches. He didn't need to raise his voice. The room was already quiet enough for every word to land exactly where it belonged. The boy's father, he said, was Sergeant Major James Cole. The name was spoken. No embellishment, no decoration, just confirmation. He was a trainer, Colonel Adams continued. He trained men who never needed applause. He trained men who would later stand in positions you're used to calling leadership. He paused for a beat. "He saved my life." Emily tightened her grip on her son's hand. Luke didn't turn to look at his mother. He stared straight ahead as if that name were standing before him in flesh and blood. During a training exercise, Colonel Adams said, when things went beyond the plan, "He pulled me away from a wrong decision and out of a situation no one was supposed to walk back from." He didn't give details. He didn't need to. Those who had served understood that some stories become truer the less they are explained. Sergeant Major Cole never wrote a report about it, he continued. He simply said, "Make sure your people get home." Someone in the room drew a quiet breath. The officer at the front desk had already lowered his head. He led Colonel Adams said, "Not with commands, with standards." He turned to Luke. "Do you know why your father didn't like to brag?" Luke shook his head slightly. "Because what he did," Colonel Adams said, "didn't require belief. It was proven by the way the people he trained stood up when it mattered." He turned to the room. "There are names," he said, "that don't need to be spoken loudly. They only need to be spoken correctly." A young officer standing in the back straightened a little. No one told him to. No one needed to. Colonel Adams mentioned a few names. Not many. No explanations. Just enough. Those who understood, understood. Former trainees. Men who would later carry different insignia on their shoulders, but from the same root. Sergeant Major Cole taught us, he said, that power is not about how easily you can silence someone. Power is about whether you can help others stand. Officer Daniels said nothing. He didn't search for a rebuttal. He couldn't. What had just been spoken wasn't an opinion to debate. It was truth delivered in person. He lowered his head. Not deeply, but enough. Luke stood up. No one asked him to. No one applauded. He stood because his body understood that something had just been returned, and there are moments when remaining seated is impossible. Colonel Adams looked at him. "You don't need to stand for me," he said. "You're standing for him." Luke nodded. "Yes, sir." He stood straight, not with the posture of someone being honored, but with the posture of someone who had just been given back what was always his. Emily looked at her son. She didn't wipe away tears. She didn't need to. In that moment, the pain didn't disappear, but it took on a different shape. It was no longer doubted. Colonel Adams lowered his voice. "Sergeant Major Cole is not here," he said, "but his legacy is." He placed his hand on Luke's shoulder. "And today," he continued, "we call it by its true name. The room didn't applaud. It didn't need to. Truth doesn't require argument. Once it is called by its proper name, it stands on its own and opens the next question. What will people do with that truth?" Colonel Adams didn't raise his voice. He didn't turn away either. He stood still, looking straight at Officer Daniels, not with the gaze of someone empowered to punish, but with the look of a man who had once taught others to take responsibility for what they did. "You don't need to explain," Colonel Adams said. "Explanations usually come before listening." Daniels swallowed hard. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. No words came. Earlier he had used words to assert dominance. Now words had become unnecessary. Colonel Adams continued slowly. You have the right to ask questions, but you do not have the right to humiliate. A pause settled over the room. No one interrupted. No one rushed in to soften it. This wasn't isolation. It was the necessary space for everyone to face where they stood. Luke stood beside his mother. He didn't look at Officer Daniels. He didn't look at Colonel Adams either. He looked at the dog tag in his hand, as if rereading something he had learned long ago. Luke, Colonel Adams called. The boy looked up. Yes, sir. Are you angry with him? The question wasn't asked to test him, but to open a door. Luke shook his head. No, sir. Why not? Luke thought for a moment. Because my father said when people don't know, you don't need to be angry. You just need to stand right. Colonel Adams nodded. Not as praise, but as confirmation. Emily stepped forward one pace. This was the first time she spoke since the truth had been named. Her voice didn't shake. It wasn't raised. It wasn't lowered. I didn't come here looking for an apology, Emily said. I just wanted my son to be treated like a child telling the truth. Daniels looked at her. For the first time, he didn't look down from above. He began, then stopped. I was wrong. Emily nodded. She didn't smile. She didn't press further. That's enough. Colonel Adams turned back to Daniels. You heard her, he said. Honor isn't about what authority you have. It's about how you use that authority when you're facing someone weaker than you. Daniels lowered his head, this time deeper. No one forced him to, but no one doubted why. Colonel Adams turned to the room. There are lessons, he said, that aren't taught in manuals. They're learned when no one is applauding. A young officer nodded slightly. Another stood a bit straighter. No one spoke. There was no need. Luke tightened his grip on the dog tag for one more beat, then relaxed it. He turned to his mother. Mom, he whispered. Can we go home now? Emily smiled just a little. Yes, she said. We can go. Colonel Adams stepped aside to clear the way. Not out of courtesy, but because he understood that some people don't need to stand at the center to hold the weight of a moment. Before passing, Luke stopped. He looked at Colonel Adams. Thank you, sir, he said, for saying my father's name. Colonel Adams placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. No, he replied. I only did what he once did for me. Mother and son walked away. Not fast, not slow. No one called them back. No one watched for too long. The room gradually returned to its rhythm, but what had just happened didn't disappear. It settled in like a reminder that didn't need to be hung on a wall. Colonel Adams paused for one more moment. He looked around. We still have work to do, he said. His voice was calm but unmistakably clear, because this story doesn't end with forgiveness. It begins there and continues through changes that no one can pretend never happened. There was no loud announcement, only an official document issued not long afterward. The police department sent a formal apology to the Cole family, acknowledging the disrespect that occurred in the line of duty. The language was precise. Accountability was clear. No blame shifted to circumstances. No consequences avoided. The letter didn't erase the past, but it marked a turning point. The truth had been recognized through action, not words alone. Officer Daniels was reassigned, not as a public punishment, but to relearn the core principle he had overlooked. He entered a training program on honoring veterans, working directly with those who had served, listening to stories that never appeared in reports. At first, he spoke little. Then he began to listen. And after listening long enough, he began to change the way he stood, the way he looked, the way he asked questions. In the station lobby, a new symbol appeared. Not large, not showy. A black and white photograph was placed where it could be easily seen. Beneath it, an old military dog tag rested respectfully in a glass case. A short inscription read, Sergeant Major James Cole. The man who taught us to stand when no one was watching. No one was asked to stop as they passed, yet many did. Luke was invited to the police academy, not as the victim of an incident, but as an example. He sat in the front row listening as young cadets spoke about why they chose to wear the uniform. No one asked how it felt to be mocked. They asked what he had learned. Luke answered briefly, just as he always did. I learned that Luke said silence doesn't mean giving up. Emily sat in the back, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't need to explain her husband any further. She didn't need to tell the story again. A legacy doesn't need repetition to survive. It only needs to be carried forward the right way. Officer Daniels stood at the back of the room. He wasn't in plain clothes. He stood straight. Not because anyone was watching, but because he understood that from this moment on, every time he stood that way was a reminder. He didn't seek Luke out to apologize again. He chose to do better in silence. On the day the photograph was placed, Luke stood before the glass. He looked at the familiar face in the frame. Not for long, not in a hurry to leave. Emily stood beside him. She didn't touch him. She didn't speak. She was simply there. My dad didn't need to speak loudly, Luke said, his voice small but clear. Neither do I. The words caused no stir. No applause followed. Yet many people stood a little straighter. From then on, during internal roll calls, an empty chair was left in place. A dog tag hung over its back. No explanation was given. New officers would ask. Veterans would answer. And the story was passed on not to glorify, but to remind there are people who create order by never needing to raise their voices. The legacy of Sergeant Major James Cole doesn't live in the photograph. It doesn't live in the dog tag. It lives in how people act when no one forces them to do the right thing. It lives in eyes that know when to pause and questions asked with restraint and power used where it belongs. Luke and his mother walked away. No one escorted them. There was no need. They carried with them something that had been fully restored. Not fame, not an apology, but dignity. Service honor stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please, share this video and subscribe to Service Honor Stories so that no memory of them is ever forgotten.